And the first question that we would like you to incorporate in along with your introduction is if you could tell us, you gave the superintendent a grade of a C, the, a C at a recent forum, and we'd like to know what can she do to get an A? And can you let us know within 2 minutes, along with the introduction, about what you think of that? So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for creating this space and for having me. Thanks so much for all of the work that you all do day in and day out, year in and year out for our students and school communities. My name is Michelle Wu. I am, in addition to being a mayoral candidate, a mom with 2 boys in the public schools. They're at the Sumner School, and have also raised my sister as her legal guardian through BPS as well. I'm in my 8th year on the council, and much of how I see the district and the challenges and the goals that have come out of this campaign have been from conversations, hundreds and hundreds of hours of conversations with school community members, visiting every single Boston Public High School to sit with school leaders and school nurses and young people and our families, spending time at Madison Park and going to visit Worcester's Voc Tech High School to really see firsthand and know where the gaps are. When it comes to leadership of this district, okay, thank you, now I see the timer, thank you. When it comes to leadership of this district, we need to be showing, I think, 2 main pieces. One is demonstrable progress when it comes to setting goals and the metrics that our families are hoping for, but also a feeling, the partnership and engagement that will bring families into decision making and into the district. And so I think on both fronts we've had challenges. It's been a very, very tumultuous time, of course, and throughout the pandemic, now in our 3rd year of the 3rd school year being affected by the pandemic, it's been a tremendous amount of uncertainty and needing to react and manage crises. But the big picture issues have been the same since before the pandemic, and we need to make sure that our families have a pipeline and mechanism for giving feedback and working in partnership with the district.
Councilor Wu, could you please be specific of what our superintendent would need to do to get an A?
So we would need to set clear goals when it comes to absenteeism, early literacy, metrics around what a whole child approach would involve, for example, food security and housing instability, to know day to day what the conditions of our families are and our young people are, and then to have personnel in place and a central leadership team that inspires faith and shows progress in getting us to those goals. What I hear from schools, school leaders and educators and school communities at the sort of grassroots level is that there's not a clear, cohesive vision of what the top goals of the district are right now and how we will be measured against those goals, as well as the contact people and the points of contact that are the accountability points for how we will actually deliver on those goals.
Thank you. So next, I'm going to introduce Edith Bazil, who's going to ask the next question. Edith.
Thank you, Chair Harvey, and welcome, Councilor. I'm so glad that you're here this afternoon. Just expanding on your reference to literacy. Literacy rates have been declining in BPS. When Boston Public Schools fails to teach students to read, they become adults and parents who may struggle with literacy and also face barriers in employment, housing, and on and on. Massachusetts passed a dyslexia screening law in 2018 requiring universal early screening, and DESE released dyslexia guidelines earlier this year outlining tiered approaches to helping students struggling with literacy. Please give examples of how you will address the literacy crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership too. I saw how our Zoom school year played out for our little ones in very, very critical stages of learning to read. In my household, last school year was K2, and seeing the difficulties for families to connect to remote learning, and then even when part of the Zoom classroom, the huge disparities in terms of reliable internet connection meant that it was hard to hear fellow classmates on the Zoom, much less the teacher, and being able to get into helping our young people learn to read. So there's a tremendous amount of need, and we've seen the gaps grow even bigger across the district throughout the pandemic. When it comes to shaping the curriculum and the tools and the practices that will be used, I believe we need to get back to a system where there's more consistency across the board and having standards district-wide that apply for literacy in particular. And to have teachers educators as part of the standing committee that will be evaluating curriculum and how we are following through with that consistency and that vision for these approaches. We need to invest more resources into schools, and particularly with an equity lens. We know that there are about 36 schools that are in particular need of resources and supports, and ensuring that we are providing the educators there with the staffing levels and the resources to be able to implement the academic programs. Now, all of this, I believe, lies on a foundation first of community, whole child approach. Stabilizing families will empower us to make sure that every child is stepping into their potential as a learner.
I just have a quick follow-up. Thank you for that response. I just want you to elaborate a little more on how would you ensure that BPS has a comprehensive infrastructure where there's equity in all schools around the resources and supports, but also the professional learning for teachers to ensure that all students are learning to read early, but also on the continuum of pre-K through 12, wherever they struggle, they are getting that kind of support at the middle school level and the high school level, and we don't forget about those students as well. Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. Well, I look forward to making sure that we are doing so, again, in partnership with educators as part of formal structures in the district. But when we think about the way that resources are allocated now, we need to move towards foundational budgets for each school that are much higher in terms of the standards that are being set compared to right now. School leaders should not be making impossible trade-offs between necessary supports on the academic and literacy side, or arts and supports for technology and professional development. So, and I hear very much the need to make sure that this continues, not just on the early side, but middle school and high school too.
Thank you. And continuing to talk more about equity, the next question is going to come from Leah Serena. Leah?
Hi. BPS has made almost no progress in the diversity of teachers over the past decade. In addition, with the increase of ELL students and the language gap between our teachers and students, it's a great or even greater than the racial ethnic gap. What would you change in current hiring and retention efforts to move the needle? And how would you hold people accountable? Please provide specific examples.
Yeah, BPS has not been in compliance with the federal order, and this is an urgent issue for not just the academic outcomes of our district, but social emotional supports, and for our students to truly be an anti-racist district. That needs to apply not just through curriculum, but through hiring practices, recruitment, supports, and promotions as well. I just want to give so much credit and thanks to colleagues on the City Council who have been leading this conversation for many, many years, even from way before I started on the council, with Councilor Tito Jackson pushing on this front to really get at not just the initial ways in which we can mold the hiring and recruitment process to open up the doors for educators of color and to set up direct pipelines and pathways for BPS graduates, for example, into these positions, pipelines with our local higher education institutions into positions, but that in the recruitment stage and in the discipline that we see, that there are racial biases as administered to our teachers of color, Black and brown educators as well. And so I support and would fund programs in partnership with our community-based organizations that are supporting teachers in developing as teacher leaders within individual schools, and in building a pipeline into administration that continues to fill with when teachers of color are promoted into or move to administration roles, that there's a very quick pipeline to make sure that we are expanding our workforce to reflect our students as well. This should be a direct connection between where our students see themselves, the programs that are available, the courses that they can take, and then the positions that they can be connected to right within the district from homegrown talent in BPS, as well as recruitment from outside BPS.
Thank you. And what ideas do you have in terms of retaining just like classroom educators too?
I mean, what I hear from our teachers right now is that morale is low because our educators have been under such tremendous stress. And so, we can talk about professional development and the supports that are needed, but sometimes just the basics of getting the working conditions and the funding right for classrooms. Teachers are paying out of pocket right now for all sorts of basic supplies and materials, trying to be the public health experts because our windows still don't open all the way. And as it gets cold, how are we going to have the proper temperatures in classrooms when we still need to keep the windows open? And so I think really focusing and supporting, at least in this moment, the mental health of our educators as well is a big priority that I want to just name coming out of the pandemic. And then, of course, ensuring that we are providing resources, stipended programs, and investments into our educators to recruit and ensure professional development.
Thank you, Councillor Wu. Councillor, continuing with that trend, basically, special ed in Boston is looking like acceleration, meaning smaller classrooms and higher resources. For Black and Latino students, it results in substantially separate placements in schools that are understaffed and under-resourced. How will you change this?
Our IEP process needs more resources in general to be able to provide supports much earlier for younger students, especially for families where there are language barriers or multilingual family members, to have an experience with the IEP process that is very different from where we are now, which involves many families falling through the gaps. We need to apply our racial equity lens and tools as we're looking at issues of and incidents of discipline across our districts as well, because what often ends up showing up because of racial biases as disciplinary actions should instead be resourced and supported through special education and through social and emotional supports much earlier on. The way that we have set up this process, it often feels like playing, tennis, trying to bat away the demands and the asks of parents, where we hear very long delays for the assessments that have been requested. And so we need more resources to be able to quickly provide these assessments for families, and to do so in a way that is culturally and linguistically competent and responsive, and then applying our tools of racial equity and analysis so that we are not seeing the perpetuation of sub-separate placements for our particularly Black and Brown young people in the district.
Councillor Wu, at this point where there are some resources, because there are some schools that the ones that tend to be predominantly white, where their special education, as we've mentioned, has the resources and the staffing. So in what you just described of utilizing the racial equity tool and making sure that assessments are done, that doesn't necessarily address the part about when it's certain populations who aren't getting access to those services, right? Because the services exist and the resources because schools that have other populations receive them. So how do you target when a particular population, and in this case, many reports have clearly stated, and I know you're aware that Black and Latino students in particular within special ed are being underserved. How do you target those two populations particularly?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I think you're absolutely right that I neglected to talk about staffing at all. And I hear often, we were just at a house party yesterday with some educators from Boston Public Schools describing how in schools where there are a higher percentage of white families, that there are, the staffing level will be 2 educators with special education licenses compared to schools with more students of color, Black and brown young people, where the staffing level is closer to a teacher and a para. Right? We need to be equitable in how we are thinking about the dollars and the human capital. So would love to dig in more and ensure that I am listening to the organizations who have the answers here on how to specifically target resources, staffing, and ensure that we're addressing this.
Thank you for following up with that. The next question, also looking at another group that frequently is underserved, will be asked by Eugenia Corbo. Eugenia?
Hi, I'm Eugenia Corbo. I'm a parent at the Mario Mana Academy in East Boston. I want to ask you a two-part question. So most English learners have not been successful using English immersion. The Look Act was passed already 4 years ago that would give students access to native language instruction. How would you ensure that we implement the Look Act? And in addition, English learners with disabilities face an extra barrier. So English learning and special ed. So what would you do to make BPS address the needs of these English learners with disabilities?
Yes, very, very common constituent conversation that we have in my office with the intersection of language barriers as well as disabilities that need support through our special education services. So one of my earliest pieces of legislation on the council was to guarantee language access, and this has been a priority of mine as someone who grew up in a multilingual family, and English is not my first language. I learned it in school as well. We need to be expanding and putting more resources to bilingual and multilingual education programs. This is such an asset for our students, and we cannot approach it from a deficit-based lens here. And then especially again, talking about the process of navigating IEPs and assessments, we need to meet parents and legal guardians where they're at when it comes to students with disabilities, and the IEP process needs to have barriers taken down, particularly on the language side and when there are overlaps with multilingual families and the disability community. I think overall, this is a commitment to lift up and value our students' identities across the district. Right? Part of being an anti-racist district is ensuring that we are staffing, resourcing, and identifying the strengths of our district, which include having so many students from immigrant backgrounds and multilingual families. So let's ensure that we are creating more programs that are dual language programs, and this will be a huge draw as well for many families who see this as a benefit.
And one quick follow-up. So will you also favor the creation of additional dual language programs that include inclusion classrooms to bring in these students with disabilities into dual language?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, and our next question that will be asked by T. Wen. T.
Good afternoon. My name is Wen, and I'm a senior at South High School in South Boston. So there are two topics that I would love to hear more about your perspective today. So first, about the safety officer in school. So research show that safety officer in school do not enhance school safety and may be detrimental to Black and Latino students and students with disability. So my question are, do you think there is the need for safety officer at school? And how would you strengthen the restorative justice practices in school, contrast to the harsh discipline practices that have been the pattern for Black and Latino students in BPS?
Yes, thank you so much, T, for this question. I have seen this research. I stand with community members and so many organizations who have pushed to ensure that we are stopping school to prison pipelines and the criminalization of our students. So I support, or how do I phrase this? I support removing police, school safety officers and police from our school buildings. I have visited every single Boston Public High School, and you feel as soon as you step foot in the door when there are metal detectors versus schools with beautiful settings that are well resourced. And so I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of your question.
Yeah, so the second part is, so how would you strengthen the restorative justice?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. This is a matter of not just resources and training and professional development for school leaders and administrators and educators, but a facilities question as well, right? As we've been having build BPS conversations from many years ago, one important point that was brought up is that we need to have spaces for restorative justice conversations. So I look forward to really investing in this and making BPS a model for how we are helping our students heal, and again, pushing for identity affirming anti-racist curriculum that will also reflect our students and ensure that we are moving away from a system that perpetuates the disparities that we see.
Yes, thank you for your response. And my second topic is about the baseline budget, also known as the foundation budget. So do you support a baseline budget, or what Superintendent Casilius called a quality guarantee, in which every school has the fund to provide a set of basic education offerings like the libraries? If so, what programs and facilities would you include in that guarantee to support the students?
Yes, I absolutely do, and agree. I think quality guarantee is a good way to describe it, because this is not about this is about moving away from a starting point where the dollars present necessary trade-offs, and instead saying this is what we are going to guarantee as part of a whole child education for each one of our young people in our classrooms. So this is part of the education plan that we have up on our website. So a little more details there, but I want to make sure this is not only about well-resourced, high-quality academic offerings and a range of offerings, but arts programming and professional development and social emotional supports, everything that our young people need as human beings, not just as what is tested for by certain tests. So that foundational budget should reflect our commitment to equity and to quality across the district.
So my follow-up question is that how can you guarantee and make sure that these changes gonna happen?
When we think about the way that budget dollars have been allocated in the past, the weighted student funding formula always came with additional ways to try to soften the blow, because it can reinforce cycles of disinvestment and therefore under-enrollment in our schools. So we need to start from a place where the budget process focuses on those basic guarantees. I think that for me, the 4 big pieces of our education plan are around closing the gap for early education and universal pre-K, which will empower our learners to be the most prepared possible headed into kindergarten and first grade. Second is whole child support, so that a children's cabinet would connect all the resources that city government has focusing on our young people. Third is a facilities plan, a Green New Deal for Boston Public Schools, which would include the investments that would allow for performing arts spaces and restorative justice spaces and science labs and many tangible pieces of learning and of social and emotional supports. And then last but not least is vocational education. So across those 4 areas, that is where we will be measuring success and putting funding and staffing in. And most of all, how you ensure that things move forward in Boston especially is by having the structures where community organizations and activists are consulted regularly and weigh in on the progress that we're making and the gaps that still remain.
Thank you,
Thank you for
Councilor
your
Wu.
response.
So the next question regarding Build BPS by Ohenia Corbo will allow you to expand a little bit more.
Yes, you already touched briefly on these in your answer about safety and your answer about budget. So Build BPS is now in the 5th year of a 10-year timeline that it originally had. Many schools have closed, but there has been no new construction that wasn't already in the works before Build BPS. So Build BPS has harmed Black and Latino school communities. So how will you ensure that there is a comprehensive and equitable facilities plan that provides Black and Latino students quality facilities? And could you please give 3 specific examples?
I always thought that we started Build BPS from the wrong initial starting point and the wrong frame, which was that we were going to pick a dollar amount that sounded big but reasonable and then try to divvy it up among some places there. That is never how we get to serving all of our students. We need to, just as we were talking about with the foundational budget question, start with the baseline that each one of our young people and school communities deserve, and then figure out how to find the resources to make that happen. We need every building to be healthy, energy efficient, inspiring places to learn. And in fact, I'm the only mayoral candidate from throughout this race that outlined a specific facilities plan for the Boston Public Schools, the baselines that we would seek to guarantee, and the scale and scope of how to get it done. Boston's credit rating right now, we are below our borrowing limit. There's space for more funds directly from the city through our capital budget to make improvements, especially from new financing mechanisms such as floating green and social bonds, which I've already started pushing and leading on the council for. And then now,
而家響呢一個市政廳裏邊，佢哋係需要
liên bang hợp tác với nhau để giúp cho thành phố.
Necesitamos un nuevo financiamiento y mecanismos
Todas las componentes.
que todo sea más verde y que esté asociado con la comunidad.
More community engagement on in particular, though, is how we ensure that our school seats, the sort of location of our school seats, matches where the need is, because there are right now it's a separate conversation from our larger planning, zoning, and development conversation. So every school should be updated, and the facilities that we are proud of, to make a plan to have that happen, to obtain swing space so that we can maintain this plan and have a space to move our school communities into with regular maintenance, and then to ensure that we are truly looking at the partnerships that will be necessary to make this happen.
Thank you. A quick follow-up just to refocus this and bring it back to my question about Black and Latino families. How will you rebuild trust among those Black and Latino families that have felt like Build BPS has so far been more like closed BPS?
Yes, that's right. We need to have a different frame for what we're aiming for, and to have a community engagement process that really follows the lead of our community members, right? It is not right that time after time we see communities asking for improvements and investments and basic health and safety fixes, only to be told there was no money, and then suddenly the building is failing and crumbling and it needs to be shut down. It feels like gaslighting across the district over and over and over again. What happened with the McCormick School is unacceptable. With the school community and surrounding community calling for an investment to keep a space available as part of the school grounds, and votes with how that process played out to take that away. And so every school deserves green space next to that school, programming and the facilities to support that kind of vision of a whole child, whole community approach, and that should be baked into our facilities plan.
Thank you. Our next panelist with the question is Ms. Edith Bazell.
Thank you, Councilor Wu. You've mentioned a little bit on this topic, and perhaps you can prioritize. Boston Public Schools has committed to becoming an anti-racist district, yet there remain policies that continue to leave Black and Latinx students behind. And you talked about some of it with Bill BPS, et cetera. Please share perhaps your 3 top action steps to which you can commit to improve educational equity for Black and Latinx students in Boston Public Schools. Thank you.
Thank you. So first, we need to be looking at the data and very clearly following through on disciplinary practices across the district and pushing into a restorative justice frame. We are not all the way there with implementation of the school discipline policy that over the last few years has been moved forward. Second, we just voted on at the City Council a piece of legislation that I was proud to be one of the lead sponsors for, in partnership with a wide community coalition, that would stop any information share, codify the prohibition of any information sharing between schools and federal immigration authorities, as we have seen examples of the school to deportation pipeline play out in Boston Public Schools. And third, ensuring that the resources that we're putting into the district, both public and private dollars, reflect equity in how they are allocated.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And to give you another opportunity to talk a little bit more about how to close some of the racial inequities, Megan Wolf will ask the next question.
Councilor Wu. A study showed that the home-based student assignment system adopted in 2013 has widened racial inequities in access to quality schools. So 2 questions related to this. One is, what assignment changes would you propose to address that? And 2, what is your stance on neighborhood schools?
You know, I've been through this assignment process now multiple times in all different ways, at all different grades and entry points. And the bottom line is that, of course, we are seeking to ensure equity in every decision or process or structure that the district has. But as long as we are still trying to start from the starting point of too few seats that truly are well-resourced and support and represent the full support of Boston Public Schools, no matter how we most equitably allocate those access to those seats, we are still falling short of serving all of our students. And so I would want to make sure, okay, so this is just a point to make, that I want to make sure, especially at the high school level, that we have a comprehensive school to career pipeline for every single high school, and that we are focusing on seats at all of our BPS high schools. In terms of the assignment process, you know, I think that the ways in which we are allocating, we're counting schools rather than individual seats, tends to exacerbate inequities. So there are small tweaks in there that, you know, counting how many schools are in a bucket that's available to each family is different from counting the number of seats available at each school, and therefore the true access to those seats by different tiers. So looking at the technical changes there. And then in terms of neighborhood schools, you know, until we are at a point where there is high quality seats equitably allocated and in every single neighborhood, we need to ensure that the assignment process reflects the ability for families of from every community to access quality across our district.
Thank you for that. So just as a follow-up and related to that last thing you said, people often criticize the current system due to the cost of transportation. And this has come up recently in school committee and by the superintendent. Others call transportation the price that we pay for correcting the segregation in the city and limited access to high quality schools in some neighborhoods. How do you balance those, transportation and access?
You know, transportation is the, okay, no pun intended, transportation is the vehicle by which we are connecting our students to the quality that is available across the district. And we can't say that this is the goal in and of itself without addressing the fact that there are the concentration of schools that are under-resourced are in Black and Brown communities in Boston. So again, this connects back to the Build BPS and facilities question, how we make investments, where we prioritize the rebuilding and major renovations of our school districts, the investments of resources should start in Black and Brown communities and in parts of the district where we need to direct those resources. The goal shouldn't be to cut transportation costs. The goal should be to deliver high quality, well-resourced options all across the district, and the transportation costs will take care of themselves as we figure out where our students want, how our students want to fit within that system.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Wu, as you know, many constituents in Boston have a priority on education, and in particular, Boston Public Schools. So we'd like to know, will you be willing to commit within 100 days, if you are elected, to meet with this group to discuss ways to help support and improve Boston Public Schools for all of our children?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. We genuinely appreciate that commitment. And we have 3 minutes left, and I want to give you an opportunity to speak on whether it is school committee or exam schools, to share your final points, because I know you do have to jump off sharply in 2 minutes at 4:45.
Great. Well, thank you so much for, again, making sure that we are having a targeted and focused conversation on BPS. The reality is that, no set of 2-minute answers is gonna be able to get us to the type of momentum and commitment that we need. I have skin in the game and I'm proud to be a Boston Public Schools parent. This is where I'm really excited to lean in personally. There are many parts of the city where we will have very dedicated and talented folks running policy in different areas. Where I want to see the mayor, and should I be so lucky to serve in that role, spend her personal capital and time and energy is investing in the next generation and ensuring that, in partnership with the superintendent, that we are transforming the trust between school communities and the district, as well as the scale of ambition that we have. My school plans have been called pie in the sky. I embrace that and wear that as a badge of honor, because that is what I won't settle for anything less than reaching what our students deserve. And we know that Boston is a mecca of higher education, of jobs, of growth, and there is no reason why we, except for political will, why we shouldn't be wrapping around each one of our students with all of that, making Boston, the city of Boston, their classroom rather than just in any individual school building. So in terms of, so the specific questions that were thrown in here as well, school committee, I support a majority elected committee for democratic accountability, retaining some appointed seats to ensure representation and to ensure accountability for the mayor's office. With the exam school and exam school enrollment, I support having an exam grades and socioeconomic criteria for equity throughout that process. And overall, again, this is about every single seat in our school district should have the resources, the full political will and support of the mayor in making it such that we are providing what's possible for our students and matching the potential of each one of our young people in our schools. But thank you so much for having me, and thanks for
Thank you. All right, take care. Bye. So as Council Wu jumps off, we are going to take a 10-minute break to give our interpreters an opportunity to also rest. Councilor Essaibi George we'll begin with her session right at 5 o'clock. So please give us a few minutes, 10 minutes, and then we'll be back to ask the same questions with Councilor Essaibi George so we can hear her perspective for our city and our public schools. So thank you. To come here. Welcome, Councilor Essaibi George. Thank you for being here.
It is my pleasure. I was here a little bit earlier and realized I was early.
Yes. So we appreciate you joining us back promptly as 5 as scheduled. So thank you very much. As you know, my name is Roxy Harvey and I'm with SpedPac, and we're going to jump right in. The first question we have for you, and we'd like you to incorporate with your introduction, is that you gave the superintendent a grade of C at a forum. What would she need to do to get an A? And if you could list specific examples. Thank you.
I'm sorry, do we have a timer too? I just want to double check. Or is this an open conversation for us?
You should be able to see the timer now.
There it is. Thank you. No, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to meet with all of you, to talk with all of you, and discuss the very important work of leading our schools, and certainly leading our schools in partnership with not just our superintendent and our school committee and central office, but with our school leaders, our school teachers and educators, as well as our school families, and I think most importantly, our kids of the Boston Public Schools. We've got a great deal of work to do. And I want to, now I've got the chat box jumping up there, and I want to do this work in partnership with all of you. You ask about that grade question, and to improve that grade question, we have to improve the experiences for all of those partners in this work. When we think about our school communities, our kids, our families, as well as our district as a whole, and certainly improve the outcomes and the experiences of each and every one of our kids. And for the superintendent to receive high marks from me, especially as a former educator, I want that superintendent to be very specifically focused on the work of helping our kids every single day. First and foremost, being able to truly understand how we are spending the $1.3 billion budget that we invest in our Boston Public Schools every day. And I want to be able to answer that question as mayor. And that $1.3 billion, how much of each dollar spent is going into student-facing services. And when we're able to answer that question and get to the highest number possible, we're able to do things like make sure that we're investing in early literacy, that we're supporting our students in special education, that we're providing services to ELLs, that we're looking at grade reconfiguration in a more thoughtful way, that we're looking at high school redesign, and that we are making sure that our kids are recieving the support services they need from full-time
recibe supporte apropriado,
servicio de apoyo que necesitan los
especially as it relates to
những kinh nghiệm, đặc biệt là ở trong trường.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. And the next question we're going to have is going to be asked about literacy from Edith Bazil.
Thank you, Chair Harvey, and thank you for being here, Councilor Essaibi George. I'm glad you mentioned literacy. That's the focus of my next question. So the literacy rates have been declining in BPS. And when Boston Public Schools fails to teach students to read, they become adults and parents who may struggle with literacy and may face other barriers such as employment, housing, etc. My question is, Massachusetts passed a dyslexia screening law in 2018 requiring universal early screening, and DESE released dyslexia guidelines earlier this year outlining tiered approaches to helping students struggling with literacy. Please give specific examples of how you would address the literacy crisis. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Edith, for that question, and thank you for your continued work in this space and in so many other efforts across our school district, especially as it relates to serving our kids and meeting them where they are. Certainly early literacy gives us an opportunity to identify students who are in crisis, who are dealing with some difficulties in their learning. And it also affords us an opportunity as a district to respond to those needs, to meet kids early and offer them the supports they need at that point. And we know when we meet kids early with their needs, we're offering them greater opportunity to achieve academically, to engage socially, and to have very successful both academic careers with us in the Boston Public Schools, and it also helps them engage in so many other aspects of their life. That's why having a coordinated literacy program across all of our schools and supporting our teachers with professional development and other resources so that they're able to deliver that curriculum to all of our kids, and also having the support services in place. I'm a proponent of inclusion in our classroom, especially when it's done right and done with the appropriate number of educators in the classroom and supports for our kids who need those additional supports. We need to be able to do it all and do it for our kids, because that foundation is so incredibly important. And it also helps us when students do require additional services like dyslexia services. It gives us an opportunity to deliver that in the classroom or in a supportive environment during the school day. And that helps our kids engage, again, starting at those earlier ages. If they're better equipped and supported to engage in academics, their opportunity for achievement is through the roof. So getting that early literacy in early, making sure that we're doing the screenings early and providing those support services early is critical to student success. I also want to add how important it is to engage families in that work so that they too can continue that support at home.
Just a quick follow-up. I appreciate you in scaling across the district with a comprehensive literacy framework to ensure all schools have that support. And also you talked about early literacy. How would you focus on certain populations, particularly those middle and high school students who continue to struggle with literacy, students with disabilities who are not getting the interventions that they need to help with those tiered support so they're reading independently, fluently, and gaining meaning directly from printed text? How would you ensure that those services are scaled pre-K all the way up to high school?
Well, certainly need to work with the school department to ensure that that's happening from the district level, but then making sure that each school has access to the resources they need in the building. When schools are scurrying around to pull in those supports for their kids across all grade levels, we know kids don't have the full time that they're allotted, don't have the full attention of the educator that's supposed to be supporting them, because educators are being pulled in so many different spaces. We also need to make sure that we're empowering our families to engage in that advocacy and to understand the rights and the opportunities that their child has been given and afforded through their IEP or 504. And, you know, as it relates to all learning disabilities or needs for students, we need to make sure that students are engaged, students' families are also engaged in that work. But it does have to be scaled up. Literacy doesn't start after those baby years. It has to continue throughout a child's entire learning. But we have to make sure that that's a strong foundation built at the beginning.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eva.
Thank you. And the next question is going to come from Leah Serrata about diversity of teachers. Leah?
Hello, I am Leah. I'm one of the chairs of the Black Educators Association and one of the field reps of the BTU. BPS has made almost no progress in the diversity of teachers over the past decade. In addition, with the increase of ELL students, the language gaps between our teachers and students is as great or greater than the racial ethnic gaps. What would you change in current hiring and retention efforts to move the needle? And how would you hold people accountable? Please provide specific examples.
Oh, there you are, Leah. You weren't on my screen at first. I was looking for you. Thank you for being here and asking that question specifically, because diversity is certainly important across all of our city business, whether it's in our housing department, in our police department, in my cabinet as mayor, in my office today as a city councilor. And absolutely, it's so critically important that our children across the district see a reflection of themselves and those that are teaching in the classrooms, especially if we want to think about making sure that educators of the future are educators of color educators with cultural competencies across the spectrum, and educators with lots of language experience and fluency. If they don't see a reflection of themselves today as students, they're not going to explore those careers down the road. We need to recruit from within, make sure that our students, especially our high school students, see an opportunity in education for themselves. We need to very directly recruit from our universities and our teacher ed programs, both locally and beyond locally, to make sure that we are recruiting a diverse workforce for our schools. And then that retention piece, because I think in many ways we've gone backwards, and we've seen a particular challenge in retaining male educators of color across our district, both in classroom positions and in leadership positions. We've got to do more around ongoing professional development and support, and creating opportunities for greater collaboration, and with our younger teachers, making sure that there are supports around licensure, the testing, adding licenses to your current portfolio, and making sure that you have the supports in place to do that. And then creating environments within each and every one of our school buildings, school communities, that's welcoming to that diversity. I think it's also important to tap into lived experiences with our educators to build stronger bonds with our children. We know that that relationship is so critically important to the success of kids in classrooms.
Thank you. And how would you—
I feel like we need more time for that question.
It's okay. I do have one follow-up. How would you hold the district accountable for this?
Well, it's holding me accountable for this as mayor of the city, working in partnership with the school district. But in the end, it's my responsibility. I want this job. I want to do this work, and I need to be held accountable for it. And it's really empowering the office. And Saren Daly, who I've worked with in a couple of different capacities, not just now as a city councilor, but during my years teaching, has done a tremendous amount of work, but with very few resources. We need to make sure that our efforts around teacher diversity are more than just in name only, that there is a workforce, that there is investment in the efforts to recruit and then retain. And our teaching force needs to reflect the students in which they serve, in both racial diversity and ethnic diversity, as well as linguistic diversity. That's really important for me, because it is in such direct relationship to student success. There also needs to be that gender piece, because we do know in education that we have a high percentage, especially at the lower grades, of it being a female-led profession, and want to support that, but also recognize the role that men and men of color play in our classrooms.
Thank you, Councilor Essaibi George. Next question is, it's been said that special education for most white students in Boston looks like acceleration, meaning small classroom sizes and high resources. For Black and Latino students, it results in substantially separate placements in schools that are understaffed and under-resourced. How would you change this? And can you give some examples?
Sure, thank you for that. And so much of that starts with early literacy, early screening, and opportunities to really engage families in the work that's happening in schools. Families have to be an important partner in this effort, and educators need to commit to building true relationships with their students to fully understand their needs. Too often, it's too easy to place Black and brown boys in particular in sub-separate classrooms, although we see a growing concern with Black girls especially. We need to make sure that we are providing services first in the least restrictive environment and really responding to the needs of our kids. But it's around early intervention, early screening and early intervention. And it's about making sure that we aren't asking our families to fail up. And in particular, realizing just off the bat throughout our education system, it's our white families that have access to the resources, the tools, and the attorneys to fail up that system quickly to get the services to their children. And we don't have similar resources available to our poor communities, and to our poorer families, and to our families of color who are disproportionately pushed out of regular ed classrooms into sub-separate environments when it's not always the best placement for their child. And when I think about, the 5 or 6 immediate things that we're going to focus on under my administration as it relates to our schools, special education services, especially sub-separate classrooms, and special education students who are also ELLs have to be a serious starting point when we think about creating greater opportunity for our kids, increasing achievement for all of our students, and also investing dollars into schools that are, coded as low performing. When we invest resources in the right places, when we do inclusion right and meet our kids where they are immediately, we provide those resources and we see higher achievement.
Thank you. As a follow-up question, I'd be interested in how you relate some of the schools that are more predominantly white and they have those two special education providers in the classrooms and sometimes with a para also. And then you have the other schools who have resource kids or a lot of IEPs, and there's one general ed teacher in these schools, and those schools are predominantly the Black and brown students. So how do you change that so that you balance, because there are schools that are well resourced in this district and are well staffed in this district. They just are not serving predominantly Black and Latinx students and low income students. So how do you make that change so those services are also at the other schools?
No, I appreciate that question and that follow-up question. And I've also been asked to speak a little bit more slowly in my response. So I'm also going to say anyone that wants to go and sort of look at more detailed plans, please check out my website. I'll put the links and everything into the chat in the next few minutes. Because, just because there's so much more to this than a few minutes for each question will allow us to discuss and for me to share. We need to make sure that we are doing inclusion right. And I think as a district, we rolled inclusion out too quickly and just said, okay, let's do it everywhere now, without ensuring that those classrooms were well resourced. And a classroom that needs teachers with multiple licenses doesn't mean a teacher with multiple licenses and a paraprofessional that's not dedicated to that classroom. Because I know, based on my own personal experiences as a classroom teacher, my experiences with my 4 children, and the experiences I've seen as a member of the city council involved in this work, that's what we do as a district. If we're truly going to do it right, we need to make sure that you're on mute on that timer, that we are investing in the right teacher to student ratio and ensuring that any paras assigned to those classrooms are truly assigned to those classrooms and not pulled to do other things.
Thank you.
And Roxy, I know I didn't fully answer it. Maybe in my closing, I'll go further into it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And another vulnerable population are English learners. Eugenia Corbo will ask the next question regarding that.
Hi, Counselor. I'm Eugenia Corbo, a parent at the Mario Mana Academy in East Boston. And you touched a bit on this in your when answering the previous question. Most English learners have not been successful using English immersion. The Look Act was passed already 4 years ago that would give students access to native language instruction. So how would you ensure that we implement the Look Act? And specifically, English learners with disabilities face an extra barrier. What would you do to make BPS address the needs of these specific English learners?
Well, so very simply, the Look Act is legislatively mandated and something that we have to follow through with. And so you've got my commitment that we're going to follow through on that. And we need to support our students who are English language learners as it relates to special education services, making sure that we are giving and providing the appropriate screening at their start to their time in the Boston Public Schools with us. Because as students with who are non-native English speakers, we know that they too quickly fall through the cracks, and we as adults have failed in evaluating them properly and screening them properly so that they get the resources they need. And then that we all know, as those interested in education, that very quickly we lose kids, and that's a problem. We also need to, as a city, embrace dual language, bilingual education across our district and make sure that we're not looking at it as a deficit. It actually is very much an asset in teaching children and including a variety of languages and dual language opportunities is a way to create greater fluency in a native or first language. It's also really better for the child to engage in their academics to be able to do this and also maintain the very important connections to culture and to race and to ethnicity and to family and to community. So for me, that has to be a bigger part of what we do. I'd like to see us expand dual language programs across our city, thinking about some of the growing opportunities, whether it's within the Haitian community or the Cape Verdean community or the immigrant African community, and even the Arab community that is a growing population of students who are ELLs across our district. Providing those services is an important part of our obligation if we're going to truly support kids and make student-facing decisions and respond to their needs, both in the quote-unquote regular ed as well as the in special education services.
A quick follow-up, since you just
Yeah.
mentioned applying all these to special education services, would you specifically support the incorporation of inclusion classrooms in dual language strands?
Yeah, the answer is yes to that. I will be very honest with you, though. We've got to get inclusion right in our school system. And I think one of the challenges we've faced is we know inclusion is a good thing. And so when we made that decision, we simply rolled it out to so many schools, and we've seen the disparities between schools. And I think to Roxy's question, or I think it was Roxy, around the disparities between schools that have larger populations of white kids versus schools that have higher numbers of kids of color and Black kids in particular, we see it done right in the schools with higher rates of white kids as opposed to schools with higher rates of kids of color. I want to make sure that we're doing the inclusion piece right as we roll into dual language programs. I'd like to do it and commit to it, but I want to be very honest with you. We've got to do it well, because we do a tremendous disservice to our kids when we fail them this way.
Thank you.
Thank you. And our next two questions are going to come from our student panelist, T. Wen.
Hi, my name is Thi Nguyen, and I'm a senior at South High School in Boston. So I have two topics. Would like to know more about your perspective. So the first one is about the safety officer in school. So research shows that safety officer in school do not enhance school safety and may be detrimental to Black and Latino students, and also students with disability. So my question are, do you think there is the need for safety officer at our schools? And how would you strengthen the restorative justice practices in school, contrast to the harsh discipline practices that have been the pattern for Black and Latino students in BPS?
Thank you, T, very much for that question, and good luck in this last year at Excel. It's an exciting time, and I'm grateful that you're participating in today's conversation. I found my own sort of political voice and desire for political activism as a high school student myself. I've talked about this quite a bit when we think about the role of school resource officers, different than police officers in our school buildings, and the important role and sometimes necessary role they play in our school communities, obviously with very strict adherence to proper training and proper protocol and proper partnership in our school communities. We also need to make sure that we're not just simply talking about restorative justice and rolling out whether it's the circulars that school community members, school educators receive on restorative justice practices, but that we're actually fulfilling the goals of restorative justice in all of our schools, both after an incident, but also before an incident. So school communities are much more engaged in the restorative justice practice. And I think if we engage in restorative justice practices early, we build stronger relationships in school communities, both between students and young people and students in school community, adults, teachers, educators, other faculty in that building. I am not a proponent of the Boston Police being in our schools. We have seen, unfortunately, in the last couple of months, in some cases because of a crazy TikTok challenge, and in other cases, some real issues around violence. We've got to get to the root causes of trauma that our kids are experiencing to really fulfill what I think the promise of school should be in supporting the whole child. That's why I've worked to make sure that we have a full-time nurse in all of our school buildings, that we have a full-time social worker in all of our school buildings, and that our teachers have access to the resources they need to support our kids, and that kids have the opportunity to be kids in our school buildings. And, you know, restorative justice plays a part in all of that, both as a opportunity for a deeper community building and relationship building, but obviously, you know, after something maybe has happened in the school community.
Yeah, and thank you for that response. And my next topic is about the baseline budget. So do you support a baseline budget, or what Superintendent Casillas called a quality guarantee, in which every school has the fund to provide a set of basic education offerings like the libraries? And if so, what programs and facilities would you include in that guarantee?
Yes, I've over the years have been publicly supportive of baseline budget and have worked to ensure that our schools have the things that they need as part of that baseline budget, whether it's the full-time nurse or full-time social worker. We're making moves to make sure that every school has access to a library or a librarian, either on campus in that school building or in close proximity. We think about a couple of our schools that have attached or very close, in close proximity, public libraries to them. We need to make sure that we're providing those services to all of our kids. In addition to those, you know, those items as part of the baseline, ensuring that our kids have high quality facilities, that our kids have, you know, an opportunity for athletic programming and music and art programming. That's really important to me, both from a couple of different perspectives, as a graduate, as a parent, as a former teacher, as someone who's been very much engaged in the work of Boston Public Schools and public education here in the city of Boston. We need to be working towards that baseline and making sure that we're, you know, looking at our schools who are missing some of those components and filling in the holes with the resources to make sure that it's there permanently. And then the next part of that conversation and the goals has to be, you know, that those providers are also culturally competent, are speaking the languages that our students speak, are able to certainly reflect the diversity of the student population in any particular building. Those have to be also primary goals when we're thinking about baseline budgets and who and what should be happening in each one of our school buildings. I've lost the timer too, by the way, I'm sorry.
Thank you for that response. And my follow-up question is that, so can you be more specific about how can you gonna make sure that these changes gonna happen at each of the school instead of just like valuing the words?
Yeah, so I mean, as mayor, there's certainly authority and power in that office. And as a city councilor with very little actual power and authority, I've been able to move the needle on a number of those things in that capacity through building relationship and negotiation and hearings. And when I think about the work that I've done on the city council around whether it is that the full-time nurse in every building, whether it's the full-time social and emotional licensed caregiver, and for the Boston Public Schools, that's resulted in every school having access to a full-time social worker. I don't know if we've hired every full-time social worker at this point, but the budget, the line item is there for that. We're now working towards and have started the process around rolling out ethnic studies in all of our schools in a greater way, starting with our pilot, building from there and then building district-wide. The same with, I just lost my train of thought. There was one more thing. I just lost it. Oh, the libraries and library services. You know, when I think about my work on the council and the way I've conducted myself, we've been pulling these pieces together. We now, as mayor, through my administration, will have greater opportunity to work in a leadership role with the school district, with the superintendent, to make sure that it is in fact reality for all of our school communities.
Thank you for your response.
Thanks, T.
Thank you. And I'm going to use a little bit of that follow-up time from T's first question to ask the question about your comment that's in the chat about what is the connection between cops and restorative justice? If there's a restorative justice, then school police aren't needed, correct? Or what is your thought around that?
If restorative justice is done well and done right, there generally is not a need for school resource officers in our buildings. We do know that our school resource officers play an important role in de-escalation. the help that we need. We also need to make sure that we have clinical social workers in all of our buildings. That's been a big part of the work that I've done. But we do, unfortunately, experience violence in and around our schools. And we do need to make sure, as a former educator, as a parent, as a community member, and as an elected official, you know, one of my core responsibilities is to, as it relates to our schools, is making sure that kids have access to a rigorous academic curriculum, that they have opportunities for enrichment and wraparound services and supports, and that they are also in a safe school community. Those things are and have to be central to the work that we do as a school district. You know, and we've seen, unfortunately, this school year, incidences of students coming to school with loaded guns in our schools already this school year. And we have to work every single day, both in school, in community, at home, and in other settings, to make sure that our kids aren't experiencing violence, aren't experiencing poverty, aren't experiencing trauma, have opportunities to enter the workforce. We also need to make sure that they are safe at school. And I know with a number of individuals that we disagree about having school resource officers available to our school communities, but we disagree on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that follow-up answer. And to continue to talk about buildings, the next question will come from Ohenia Corbo around Build BPS.
Hello again. You touched on this a tiny bit in your answer about the baseline budget.
Yeah.
Build BPS is now in the 5th year of its originally planned 10-year timeline. Many schools have closed, and there has been no new construction that wasn't already in the works before Build BPS. And Build BPS has harmed Black and Latino school communities. So how will you ensure there is a comprehensive and equitable facilities plan that provides Black and Latino students quality facilities? And if you could please give us 3 specific examples.
Sure. And I would like the timer somewhere on the screen so I could see it. I'm trying to manage my responses here.
Just we'll get that spotlighted.
If possible. There we go. Thank you. Yay. I saw that pop up in the chat. You know, the Build BPS plan is all of you know, is $1 billion investment that former Mayor Walsh made, and $1 billion unfortunately only touches about 10 schools in a meaningful way. We need several $1 billion more to upgrade our complete portfolio in the way that it needs to be. And oftentimes that conversation around the initial Build BPS plan was focused on schools that were built post-World War II. The post-World War II buildings aren't actually our biggest problem. It's the newer buildings that we've seen the greatest disrepair, falling apart. When we think about the West Roxbury Education Complex, when we think about the Jackson Man, for example, those are 2 glaring examples of that. I am committed to, and I've said this out loud, the infrastructure dollars that are coming in from the federal government need to be invested in our city in a sustainable way. When we invest in our kids, when we invest in our school facilities, those are sustainable investments. That's where I'd like to see a substantial amount of that money go, because we need that money for our buildings. And there'll be some opportunities on the state level as well. I think it's important that we look at our existing portfolio and we look at the previous assessments, some of that survey, and go quickly back to our school communities to understand that we're making the right decisions. But our schools that are in greatest distress, almost solely within our communities of color. I'm just sort of running through the list of schools in my head. So as much as we need to have a very active and done. You've said, this, we're 5 years into the current Build
5 años de planos.
5 en el plan.
So quickly is the objective, certainly transparently through this process, but we have to move quickly. We've delayed too long for our schools. And yes, I see Mike's comment just popped up. HVAC, we're doing some of that now. We've got a lot more of that to do. Those are real investments in our schools.
Very quick follow-up. How will you rebuild the trust among Black and Latino families that over the last few years have felt like Build BPS is more like a closed BPS? in their communities.
Yeah, and when I think about everything that that BPS does, from central office to the school committee to even our school communities, we've got to better engage with our city's residents, with our city's families, and with our kids. And our leadership at central office, our school committee, and school leadership needs to be a better reflection of, and I think this also goes to school teachers, needs to be a better reflection of the communities in which it serves. And we think about our Black and brown kids in particular, when we also think about our immigrant communities with the languages spoken at home, we've got to better communicate with and connect with our school families and our kids. And that's important at central office. It's critical at the school level. I'm sorry, Ruby, I know I'm trying to talk slower and get everything in.
Thank you. And the next panelist that has a question for you is Ms. Edith Bazell.
Thank you, Chair Harvey. Annissa, Essaibi, George, although Boston Public Schools has committed to becoming an anti-racist district, BPS policies continue to leave Black and Latinx students behind. And you talked a little bit about that already. Would you please share what your 3 top specific actions that you can commit to improve educational equity for Boston, for Black and Latinx students in Boston Public Schools would be?
You know, I want to say it's special ed, and special ed, because we have failed specifically Black and brown kids through our special education department time and year and generation again. We've got to focus on the services that we're offering or not offering in a timely manner to our kids, Black and brown kids in particular, as it relates to special education services. I also think that the diversity question among our educators and our school leaders and at central office is also directly results in some of the unconscious bias that exists within the decisions that we make across our school districts, and our school buildings. We also know the disproportionate effect, and this has come up a little bit in today's conversation, that our Black and brown kids are receiving, higher rates of discipline. And punitive discipline, suspension, expulsion. We see higher rates of students of color experiencing that. So embracing restorative justice for real in our school buildings, not just using the circular as information is really important to me. And those would be the 3.
I just want to follow up real quickly, just, outside of special ed, we know that still we have disparate rates of achievement based upon policies that impact Black and Latinx students specifically. What would you do for those students who are still not getting the high quality instruction, access to programming that would accelerate their learning and cultivate their intellect and their ability, their innate ability?
Yeah, certainly. And this came up in a conversation last night with a group of Black men around the issues that are particular to them. And when we talked about families, we talked about children, we talked about the loss of advanced work classrooms in our schools that are predominantly schools almost exclusively of color. Returning academic rigor and opportunities for advanced work, for example, into those schools would be certainly a starting point when we think about achievement for our kids, and recognizing that our kids of color can achieve at these high levels, and doing that in our high schools too. We've seen us walk away as a city from advanced placement in our high schools, in our district high schools in particular, across our city. And then back to the language question, when we think about our students who are English language learners and kids of color, there are opportunities to do advanced AP courses in native languages. When we think about fully embracing a dual language program, fully embracing the work behind fluency and literacy, being able to provide additional AP courses at the high school level is also important to me. I also want to say in our schools, both at the high school level, the middle school level, and early ed, as it relates to extracurricular activities, higher rates of kids of color. We see lower opportunities for art and music. We see lower opportunities for athletics. And we see lower opportunities for some of those extra enrichments. That to me is all part of the foundational work, but also a direct correlation with racism across our district.
I just want to follow real quickly, because you did mention AWC, and we know that the entry rates for Black and Latinx students are very low and disparate, and they're not getting into AWC. That has been a pattern. So can you talk a little more about how you see that as an opportunity to provide equity? Would you change AWC? Would you recommend a different enrollment criteria? How are you looking at that as an equity issue?
So we've tried to do some of that with Excellence for All across all of our schools and rolling that out to more and more school communities. But Excellence for All really should be the measure in which we're conducting our K-12 system here in Boston. To say that Excellence for All and AWC are two added programs to our district, to me, is sort of, it's nonsensical. EFA should be what we're doing in all of our schools. And I think the opportunity to have a higher enrollment for our kids of color in AWC in particular, as well as advanced placement later on in the high school years, is through that early literacy support. We know when kids are engaged in a rigorous, comprehensive literacy curriculum, and their service, if they need any additional services, their needs are being met. We know kids can connect with and engage in more complex content over the years, regardless of the content type. Literacy is so critically important. And that's, when we look at fourth grade MCAS scores, for example, we see so much told to us in that data point. Not that that data point is the most important thing of all, but it does share a particular story about our failings for kids and kids of color previous to the fourth grade year. It also goes even further back than that when we think about early ed and childcare and making sure that we're supporting, whether it's the UPK programs or other early ed and childcare programs in community, that they've got the tools and resources they need to, support kids, prepare kids, especially younger kids.
Thank you.
During those formative years.
Thank you, Councilor Essaibi George. The next question will give you an opportunity to talk more about access to quality schools, and it will be asked by Megan Wolf.
Hi, Councilor.
Hi, Megan.
A study shows the home-based student assignment system adopted in 2013 has widened racial inequities in access to quality schools. So 2 questions related to this. One is, what assignment changes will you propose to address that? And 2, what is your stance on neighborhood schools?
So great question. One, I think that the biggest problem is we're accepting the idea and the concept that kids just need access to a high quality school. Every school, every classroom, every seat should be a high quality seat. We've got to invest in that to make it happen. I'm a proponent of neighborhood schools. I think that when we do such a tremendous disservice to students and to student families when we put kids on a bus from one community to another community, but they're leaving one crappy school district to another crappy school community. Every school should be high quality. And I think that kids should be going to school closer to home. What we need to do is work to diversify communities and neighborhoods and making sure that helps us make sure that schools are more diverse across our city. I also think about the enormous amount of money that we are spending on school transportation. When I joined the council in 2016, we were spending $90 million a year. We are now up to $137 million a year. And if we were to take $1 million from that budget and invest it into a lower performing school, that $1 million can account for 10 reading specialists. That $1 million could account for 9 reading specialists and an additional mental health specialist, or another family liaison that speaks the languages that the kids and the families of that school community speak. Another, it can be so meaningful and such an opportunity for dramatic change within a school community. It is something that we've got to look at doing. When we think about those dollars spent, how are they impacting kids directly, and how is it improving their academic experience and their support services? We also have to think how important it is to engage families in school communities. And when kids are in a school an hour from home or 45 minutes from home in a community that the family is not familiar with, that is a problem around family engagement.
Thanks. So as a 2 things as a follow-up. One is when Boston was looking at the student assignment system, there was some look at family engagement across schools, and were schools that had higher density of neighborhood kids, were those families more involved or less involved? And I think that there was no real difference. So just ask you to comment on that. And then also, what about neighborhoods that don't have enough schools?
Right.
So much of the transportation budget will not necessarily be alleviated. Students with special ed, students who don't have schools in their neighborhood. So if you can.
Yeah, no, it's a great, for sure, absolutely. When we have students that require special education services that aren't available close to home, it is our commitment to transport them. The same with students experiencing homelessness. I'm committed to, it's also a mandate that students are transported to school from wherever they're sheltered or staying within our school system. And then I know that communities don't all have enough seats. We do have to build in some flexibilities within each of our neighborhoods to respond to changing demographics when we think about where kid growth might be, where there might be a bubble. And we need to make sure that school communities can build in some of those to be that responsive to families of a particular school community. On the family engagement piece, schools need to be much more actively engaged in the work of bringing families into that school community. That doesn't necessarily mean directly into the building, but going and meeting families where they are and knocking on doors. Our attendance rate is very low, especially in the later years. We also need to make sure that families are asked to come into that school community. And especially when we think about our ELLs and families of color who have experienced their own trauma, especially even as it relates to the Boston Public Schools. That re-engagement, the work around re-engagement is not necessarily simple work, but it's so important to the future of our district.
Thank you. And Councilor Essaibi George, if you are elected, will you commit to meeting with our groups to prioritize improvements in Boston Public Schools within the first 100 days of your position?
Yes, I'm happy to commit to that. I would say, based on my own, on my reputation and on my attendance to date, my engagement in so many of these meetings that already happen, I think I've demonstrated a commitment to do that, certainly as mayor. And, making sure that we are doing these meetings specific to the groups, but also doing more public facing town halls with school communities. So school by school, and then, meeting as a group with all of our elementary or maybe our kindergarten kids or our, coming to school for the first time kids, our elementary school kids, our middle school aged kids and their specific needs, our high school aged kids and their specific needs. Because of my experiences and interest in the district, I'm committed to doing all of it, but certainly that.
Thank you for that commitment to this group and really the focus on K through 12. Within the next, because we've run out of time, but I want to give you an opportunity, to do a wrap up. And within your wrap up, if you could also, because two things that have come up a lot, if you could also touch on where your position is with an elected school committee and your position on the new exam schools policy while you do your wrap up, where you stand with those two questions.
And all of that in 1 minute.
You know what? You can even have two.
No, and again, I ask everybody to check out my website for thank you for the 2 minutes for greater detail on all of my education policy. I want to note that document is a dynamic document, as all of my policy papers are, because I want the public to better engage in this work, whether it's education, whether it's housing, whether it's my equity, inclusion, and justice plan, or any of it. I want you to be involved in this work. I am a proponent of an appointed school committee. I want the responsibility to, I want to be held responsible for the success or the failure of our school department. I did support the referendum question because I think it will help us have a very constructive debate and dialogue around the future governance structure of the school committee. I've already committed as a member of the student council, that's for UT, as a member of the city council. I have committed to making the nomination process more transparent. I'm also committed to engaging the city council in the appointments to the school committee. I think that it's important to have parent voice, student voice. I've done the work and hope to have passed before the end of this calendar year, the home rule petition to give the student member the right to vote and the stipend on the school committee, as well as engagement by students with special education students and students that are ELLs. all of our students and our student voices and our family voices are important in the work of making sure that our school department and our school communities are doing everything for our kids. I also will speak quickly to the exam school piece. We've spent a lot of time focused on 3 exam schools that represent a very small portion of our student body. I am a proponent of exam for entrance to Latin School, Latin Academy, and the O'Briens. I'm a graduate of the O'Briens when it was Boston Technical High School. I think it's important that we are investing similar energy and intellect and planning into what's happening in all of our high schools. In fact, our whole entire school district. I am committed to a strategic plan for Madison Park and look forward to engaging in the work of high school redesign across our district.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your time today, Councilor Essaibi George, and it was a pleasure to hear your point of views and you sharing it with our families. We just want to remind everyone, please make sure you go out and vote on November 2nd. This is very important, and you can review their answers again on the SpedPac YouTube channel and on the Facebook pages of SpedPac, St. Stephen's, Bezier, and Beam, so that you can really listen again and reflect upon what you heard from both candidates to help you make your decision on November 2nd, which is going to be a very important decision that is made next. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you. Bye, Councilor Essaibi George.